My name is Bill Haltom, and today is May the 6th, 2014, and I'm in Memphis to interview James S. Gilliland. This interview is taking place as a part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Good morning, Jim Gilliland. You've had a fantastic career in the law, in service to our country in the United States Navy, and in service to our country in your years in Washington. And today we're going to talk about that and talk about your remarkable life, and it's a great privilege to be here with you, Jim.
Thank you.
Let's start off. Let's start at the beginning. Tell me your birth date and where you were born, Jim.
Well, October 3, 1933 in Memphis, Tennessee.
Did you grow up here in Memphis?
I grew up here, went to elementary school here through the 8th grade, and then went off to Webb School in Bell Buckle, Tennessee.
Tell me about your family. Tell me about I understand your father was a lawyer. Is that?
Yeah, my dad was a lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
That was a long time ago. He graduated in he got his license in 1915, before the war, and then went into World War I and fought in the trenches in France.
Your dad's name was?
Frank Gilliland, Frank M. Gilliland.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then he had a younger brother who's a lawyer, John Gilliland, and I had a brother who's now deceased, Frank Gilliland Jr., who also was a lawyer. All of us went to Vanderbilt.
So you grew up in a family of lawyers.
That's right. Family of Vanderbilt lawyers.
Family of Vanderbilt lawyers. Let's be specific about that. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your father's law practice, what he did.
Well, I really don't know that much. He was, the law practice was very different in those days. There were very few lawyers. If you looked at the 1925 bar picture, it only had about maybe less than 100 people on it, maybe 50 lawyers on there. And so I think it was a situation where maybe 2 or 3 lawyers practiced together, but beyond that, it was just almost an English system.
When you were a boy, did you ever accompany him to the office, see your dad at work?
I was in his office from time to time, but I really don't remember much about that. He was much older than I, so therefore the time frame's a little different. He was 44 when I was born. And
tell me about your mother. What was her name?
She was Elizabeth Jordan, born in Savannah, out in Hardin County. And she was a bit younger than he, and was actually very much of a community person herself.
And what sort of activities did she have in the community?
Well, ladies in those days didn't really work, but they were very active in lieu of that. The family, you might say, recognition that passes on to this day is the fact that she was the one who came with the unpronounceable name of the Lebonheur Children's Hospital, which in those days, the small club they created called it Lebonheur.
Lebonheur, yeah.
That's right, because it was French, and they were saying they were helping children, and they just picked that name.
Lebonheur, tell us about Lebonheur Hospital.
It's one of the top couple of dozen children's hospitals in the world, located here. And the story that I was referring to started right after World War I, when a number of young ladies got together to help the children, help them in miscellaneous ways that the hospital wasn't. And they needed a name for a club, and this was my mother's name, and that's all the story. But it's a very colorful story.
And we're going to talk today a lot about your legal career and also your incredible political career and your career in community service. Did you have, as in your father as a lawyer and your mother as a community, in her community involvement, did you have role models there for your life, Jim?
Oh, sure. They were definitely role models.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that, about growing up in the Gilliland household and what you saw.
I was the third child, which is to say I was the tail end, and I had 2 older brothers, one of whom, as we have discussed, has had quite a career himself. He's an aviator with the Naval Academy, and was in combat in Germany, Korea, and went on to Lockheed, where he was the chief development test pilot.
His name was?
His name was Bob, Robert, and he's still living. He was the first first to fly the Blackbird, the SO-71 Blackbird, for which he is still recognized even at 87 years old.
The Blackbird is what?
It's a very high-performance aircraft, which flew faster and higher than any aircraft ever built. So that was sort of the family history. We had to do something competitive because that was the sort of family we had.
Was this, you may have said, was this an older brother, or was this?
Oh yeah, much older brother.
Yeah,
sure.
okay.
No, I'm nowhere near 87.
So you had a lawyer dad, a community activist mom, and then you had a heroic figure in your older brother.
Well, let's say we had it was a competitive family.
There you go. There you go. Did you have other siblings?
No, there were
Okay.
3 boys.
All right. Tell me about what part of Memphis did you grow up in, Jim?
Well, it's now on Galloway Drive over in Red Acres.
Okay.
It was kind of out in the country in those days, but
Now it's right in the middle of the city.
yeah, it's right in the middle
I'll
of the
say.
city now.
Right, right. Where'd you go to school?
Training school.
Pardon?
Training school. Well, training school was so-called training school not because we were trained out of being delinquents, but because that was the university teachers' training school.
Mm-hmm.
That was a good school.
And that was it affiliated with
University of Memphis.
University of Memphis State in those days, or
Oh,
was it
sorry.
Memphis Normal in those days?
I've forgotten what it was. It changed the name several times.
Yeah. And so that's where you started your education, and you said you eventually went to the Webb School,
Exactly.
and that's the Webb in Bell Buckle.
And Bell Buckle.
Yeah.
There's another couple of Webbs around in California and Knoxville and other places.
Why did you? How old were you when you went to the Webb School?
Freshman.
Freshman in
However old a freshman is.
Yeah, 13,
14 years
14.
old.
Yeah. What was the reason why your family sent you to Webb?
Well, my dad went to Webb,
There
my
you go.
brothers went to Webb, and it was sort of a family tradition. But it was a very, very good school, very competitive.
This would have been, you started Webb what year? 19?
Oh, I don't remember what year I started, but I was in the class of 51.
Okay, okay. What are your memories of Webb School, of Webb Bell Buckle?
Well, it was a very good school, very competitive. You weren't there to have fun. You were there to learn how to study and work, and we did. It was a small school, traditionally focused on Latin, formerly Greek, science, mathematics, but for example, the number 4 student in my class went to MIT.
Did you have any particular teachers that inspired you at Webb that you remember?
None that I would particularly refer to, but it was just a well-balanced school.
Let me back up a little bit
Yeah.
about growing up in Memphis before you went to Webb. What sort of activities did you enjoy as a child?
Since I grew up in what is now big city, but now there was a little more in the country, then it was just an open activity. We had a vacant lot next door. In the summertime, it was baseball. Wintertime, it was basketball, and in the fall was football. So it was a pretty normal outdoor type of growing up. So like the book, where did you go? Out. What did you do? Nothing. That described my growing up.
Did you, growing up the son of a lawyer, and there being so many lawyers in your family, did you at an early age envision that you would follow your father into the law?
I think probably yes, but you have so many aspirations in those days, you don't know what you're really going to do.
Mm-hmm.
But it worked out for me.
You love sports.
Yep.
We're going to get to your Vanderbilt athletic career in a
Well, I hope
little
you'll
bit.
pass quickly through that.
But so you played all sorts of sports and enjoyed that very much, very much. Tell me about. I want to hear a little bit more about your fascinating mother, and I want to ask this. You said she was involved in the community. Were your parents involved in politics?
Oh, not politics at all.
Really?
And besides that, remember this was a Mr. Crump town. And
Mr. Crump was was Boss Crump.
Mr. Crump was politics. Everybody else worked.
So Mr. Crump sort of ran Memphis. He was the boss of Memphis.
Oh, you bet.
For gosh.
I don't know, for a generation or so. He was.
Yeah. Did you meet him when you were a boy?
No, not really. I've seen him at a football game with his white hair, his big bushy eyebrows, waving at the crowd.
I've heard the stories about from your generation about as a boy seeing Mr. Crump at Crump Stadium.
Exactly.
Walking down the sidelines during the games.
That's probably where I saw him, because we'd go to the football games when we could, and Mr. Crump he liked to be seen.
He was a legendary figure. All the trolleys ran on time during his tenure. Did you get interested? We're going to talk about your involvement in politics over the years that eventually led you to Washington during the Clinton administration. But when did you first have any interest in politics? Did you have any interest as a boy?
No. As a boy, I had boyish things interested in. Interested in athletics, girls, things like that.
There you go. There you go.
It was a very normal childhood.
What's at Webb? Back to Webb. What sort of activities were you involved in at Webb? In addition to studying, apparently that was the major activity.
Well, it was a major activity, but like all prep schools, you lived on a pretty rigid schedule. You got up in the morning, you went to class, you studied when you were supposed to. After school was athletics. It just depended on the time of year as to which type of athletics, and then you studied again. So engaged in all of them. Probably the most successful one was baseball. I was the pitcher on the baseball team.
Really? Yeah. Is that the sport you loved the most? You revered the most as a boy?
Probably.
Yeah. Were the Chicks playing in those days in Memphis?
Oh, sure.
The Memphis Chicks were the Southern League baseball team.
That's right. It was a big deal to get to go see the Chicks play baseball down at Rushwood Park.
Rushwood Park. Tell us about your memories of going to Rushwood Park to see the Chicks play.
Well, it was kind of like a New Yorker going to Yankee Stadium. It was just a big deal.
Yeah. Do you remember any particular Chicks players that you, as a boy?
I do remember seeing Ted Kluszewski go 8 for 10.
The big clue, yeah.
The big clue, and he hit 3 triples in one day, which was a league record.
Now, Rushwood was located right in the middle of the city, where across from where Baptist Hospital was.
Right.
How'd you get to Rushwood for games?
I don't remember. I guess. Obviously somebody drove us down there.
Yeah. So you followed the family tradition of going to Webb Bell Buckle. Well, let me ask you some question about that. So you were just 13 or 14 when you leave Memphis and go to Webb. Was that a tough transition for you, leaving home and going to a boarding school?
Well, growing up's a tough transition, but yeah, I'd say it was. But I knew I was going. I knew I wasn't going to come home. So it wasn't anything to do except go and do the best you can.
I assume your brothers went to Webb as well?
Oh, yeah.
The whole family?
That's right.
All right. Okay. So you knew as a small boy that's where you were going to go?
Without doubt.
There you go. And then you went to Vanderbilt.
Correct.
Now, did you ever consider any other school other than Vanderbilt for your college education?
No. Not really. It was where I wanted to go to school, and I applied. It was quickly accepted, and it seemed to be the place to go.
And again, that was following your family tradition?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I had a scholarship to Vanderbilt. It came about sort of unusually because I had already gotten my acceptance. Well, I was getting my acceptance. I knew I was going. And I took an examination and came back. I'd already been accepted, and the news came in by way of a letter to me at home after the 1st of June. So I took the news in to my dad and said, "Dad, here I am being kind of big guy, really not big at all, but 17 or 18 years old." I said, "Dad, I'm going to help you out a little bit." He said, "You are?" I said, "Yeah, I am." I said, "They're going to send me to Vanderbilt on an honor scholarship." And so he listened, and he said, "Son, why'd you do that?" And he said, "Did it ever occur to you that if you get that scholarship, that somebody else is not going to get that scholarship? And they're probably a hell of a lot smarter than you are." And I remember that was a real come up, and so I thought about that a lot.
So what was your reaction to that?
Well, I guess I thought about things a little better.
Did you still take the scholarship?
Yeah, it was already a done deal.
Yeah. Okay. And you enrolled at Vanderbilt what year?
Fall of 51.
Fall of 1951.
Correct.
Okay. And what was your study? What was your major at Vanderbilt?
Turned out to be English. I only went to undergraduate school for 3 years. They had a program where you could, if you did very well, you could accelerate your way through and go to law school or med school after 3 years. So that's what I did.
Let's talk about your years at Vanderbilt, because you had some interesting experiences at Vanderbilt. What were some of the leadership positions you held at Vanderbilt?
Well, I guess I was kind of upwardly mobile in those days. I wanted to do everything. So I was involved in athletics, was involved in the publications, and involved in student activities, just pretty well everything. And so I was in the first ODK class. And
that's Omicron Delta Kappa, right?
Yeah.
Which is what? Which is what?
It's just a leadership selection. They selected 5 of us as juniors, and then the same thing in Phi Beta Kappa. They had pre-selected a few that would carry the torch to the next year, by which time I was out of undergraduate school.
So you were Phi Beta Kappa?
Yeah.
And ODK?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about, you mentioned, I want to take each of those activities and talk about them for a second. You mentioned sports first. What was your sport at Vanderbilt?
I know where you're getting. I was on the wrestling team. And so you got to understand that at Vanderbilt, unlike where you went to school in UT, athletics is not everything.
Well, I think it may have changed. But
we had a good football team last year, but I was on the wrestling team, and we rarely did very well with Auburn. The two years I wrestled the team, we never won a match against Auburn. But it was an interesting activity. Kept you in shape.
Did you hold a particular position on the wrestling team?
I was captain.
Okay, all right. And what was it about? Had you wrestled at Webb School?
We didn't have.
You were a pitcher there, but had you wrestled?
Yes, but we didn't have a wrestling team. It wasn't an inter-school wrestling league there. It was just a school wrestling.
What was it about wrestling that that interested you?
I don't know. It was just there. It was athletic. I wanted to earn a letter. I did. So it was fun, and then it wasn't fun. So depending on whether you won or lost.
What weight division did you wrestle in?
67. 167. That's right.
Okay, and so you had to keep it that weight through the season.
That's right.
My friends, including one of my sons who is a wrestler, I've seen how challenging that can be. Was that hard?
Yeah, and for me, my natural weight, excuse me, was a little between that. So I tried one time to go down, try to work my way back down to the 157, and that killed me. I couldn't do that. Didn't have any energy left. So I did better on 167.
What folks that have been, particularly at the collegiate level, have been in sports, have always have stories of what they learned in life from that. I know you said it wasn't very successful, but you're still wrestling at that high level there. In terms of the rest of your life, what did you learn from being a wrestler at Vanderbilt?
Oh, I don't say I learned any weighty lessons of life in wrestling, but I do remember that when you wrestle, before you weigh in, and then you go eat, and then there's a time before you actually go on the mat, and those are nervous times. So you've eaten, you go back, you rest. And I remember saying to myself, if I'm going to get through this match, I'm quitting. I've had enough. So then you go out there and you wrestle, and if you win, you feel great, and you look forward to the next one. If you lose, you say, I'm never going to do this. That's my last time. Maybe I'll give it one more opportunity. But I guess everybody goes through the same cycle with wrestling.
Let's talk about some of the other activities at Vanderbilt. We've talked about your academic honors. We talked about your wrestling. What other student leadership positions did you hold?
You're referring to the fact that I was editor of the Vanderbilt Chase.
I'm very interested in that,
Okay,
yes.
well,
what was the Vanderbilt Chase?
It was a Vanderbilt literary humor magazine. Think Harvard Lampoon. Only the university tended to think more of a publication of the agrarians in the Vanderbilt literary tradition.
The agrarians, yeah. Tell us about a little. For those of us who went to UT, tell us a little about the agrarian tradition at Vanderbilt, the great writers.
I'm not sure you guys at UT ever read any of the great Robert Penn Warren, Andrew
we're
Lytle.
going to take that out of the tape. But go ahead, Jim. No, go ahead.
Robert Penn Warren, some of the great writers had gone to Vanderbilt. They called themselves the agrarians for some reason, and so that was a part of the Vanderbilt literary tradition. But that did not wasn't seen exemplified in the pages of the Chase.
Now this is interesting. This is a literary humor magazine.
That's right.
And what was it about writing or editing humor that interested you?
Well, it was a publication. It was part of the student activities. I really came in not intending to be editor, but as the year progressed, I was still only a junior to be editor because I was going to law school the next fall. Then I was, through circumstances, I was asked to be editor. My associate editor was Sam Pointer, another future lawyer who's a federal judge in Alabama for many years. And so they gave us the tiller, and we did pretty well. But we had one last month. The Mother's Day edition was May, the very last edition, and that was the one that we let it all hang out for.
Tell us about the Mother's Day edition.
Well, it's kind of embarrassing. I really, this is not a preferred subject with my children either, but we published a Mother's Day edition which hardly honored mother in the traditional sense of lace and candy. So it was kind of raunchy, but hell, you trust some college kids, not even 21 years old, to go publish a magazine? In those days, the days when free speech was really began to be found at other places other than Berkeley, and we expressed ourselves in ways that the university did not particularly accept.
Did the university have any censorship control over the Vanderbilt Chase?
They underwrote the process, so there was a publications board. The publications board met and called us in and said to us, young gentlemen, this is not the type of publication that we want at Vanderbilt University, that it shall not be sold on campus. Whereupon we close the door, we say, okay, go down to the rubber stamp shop, get a rubber stamp and print "banned, not to be sold on campus," and sold it at the fraternity houses.
So you actually took advantage of the fact that it was banned by the administration.
That's right.
Campus. Yeah. Well, now was there ever any issue that with the university that you might not be able to complete your studies, finish your degree because of this Vanderbilt Chase incident?
No. Sam Pointer and I were two of their top students, and they weren't going to kick us out.
There you go. There you go. So the humor thing, for obvious reasons, really interests me. Is that had you been writing satire or humor prior to the Vanderbilt Chase at any time, like at Webb, Bell Buckle? Or?
No, and I didn't particularly continue it either, as you did.
This was okay. What other leadership positions did you hold at Vanderbilt?
In law school, I was on the law review, but that was later. So that's basically what I did.
Let's talk about law school. And I asked you earlier when you got interested in following the family tradition in law. When did you begin to realize that yes, I want to go to law school?
I had thought that's what I wanted to do, so the opportunity arose to go quickly. I don't know why I was in such a hurry, but when you're that age, you think you're in a big hurry to meet life. So when I came in the fall of 1954, which happened to be the same year of Brown versus Board. So it puts us in reference to events of the time. Nearly half the class were vets coming back from the Korean War, which was just over. So it was a highly competitive experience, far different from undergraduate school, because there, these guys were not only smart, but they also were there to work and work and work, and they did.
Was Vanderbilt in those days a national law school attracting students from around
Oh,
the
absolutely,
country?
absolutely.
It was not a regional law school. It wasn't
No, no.
Southerners. Yeah.
No, there were a lot of kids from our area, from our region, but there were also people from all over the country.
Tell me about your experience at Vanderbilt Law.
It was a good experience. I learned a lot. I learned probably more on the law review than I did just in any particular class. I later discovered how much I learned at Vanderbilt in two respects. One, as simply writing very carefully, making every word count. We focused on that on the law review for a couple of years. And the other, I learned a good bit of evidence. Our evidence professor was the retired dean of Harvard Law School, Dean Eddie Morgan, who was famous. And so some of my best friends in life came to me through Vanderbilt.
Can you share with us the names of some of those
Oh,
folks?
sure. Well, the editor of the law review, Jim Neal, was, I was associate editor. Bill Henry, who became chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, was another associate editor.
Bill Henry was the youngest Federal Communications Commission.
Yeah, appointed by
in history.
JFK.
Yeah.
That goes back a while. And Jim Evans, who was, you wouldn't know him, Bill, but he was a fine lawyer from Dyersburg, good friend of Ned McWhorter's, and he was commissioner of transportation. So there were a lot of good friends that I still keep up with. Those are still living.
So it was quite a group of emerging leaders for the profession.
Yeah, and we
in this
came to
state.
practice law. It was emphasized that if you're here, you want to be a lawyer. And if you want to do something else, go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. We're not here to teach business, man. We're teaching lawyers. Mm-hmm. It's a profession, and I really came to believe that.
You were the associate editor of the Law Review?
Yes.
And did you write anything? Did you write for the Law Review?
Oh, sure.
Notes?
Sure. There were recent cases.
Any particular cases you remember reviewing?
Probably the most significant one I wrote was the Charlotte Park case, which was on the. It was early in the conflict between the Brown versus Board of Education rulings and the established state real property laws that just were totally incompatible. And so that was then an issue that we were just getting.
You mentioned Professor Morgan, your evidence professor. Any other professors at Vanderbilt at that time that had an impact on your life?
The dean was Dean John Wade. He taught us torts, and he was a very able professor. And Dean Hartman was there. Everyone who goes to Vanderbilt Law School will remember Dean Hartman. As a matter of fact, it was pretty well. The teachers across the board were pretty darn good teachers. Mm-hmm. Bill Harbison came over and lectured to us, as did several others.
Did you realize at that time that your colleagues, like Jim Neal, did you see Jim Neal that he was going to be a great trial lawyer, or were y'all not focused on any specific part of law at that time?
I think it was all of us intended to be great lawyers. So yeah, Jim's a gifted guy. Yeah. He's a very serious student. Matter of fact, one afternoon we were playing touch football. We had a touch football team that played other parts of the university. And I was on the team, and we were short a player. And if you don't have enough players, you forfeit. So we had about 10 minutes before we were about to forfeit. So I ran up to back to Kirkland Hall and grabbed the first guy I could find, who was Jim Neal, and said, "Come on, you got to go play touch football. He had played college football, so he's an able,
played at the University of
able
Wyoming,
athlete.
yeah.
But he's wearing street shoes and a nice shirt and the like. So he grudgingly came on down, joined us. We didn't forfeit, and the deal was that just as soon as the guy showed, he was going to go back to study. But before the guy showed up, then a young guy on the other team throws the ball. The other guy, our team catches it, and Jim Neal is playing in the backfield to stay away from getting his clothes dirty in his street shoes. And he sees some guy coming. Well, Jim Neal had largely played blocking back in college. So he simply blocks a kid going downfield that must weigh about 140 pounds and sent him sprawling and got a penalty flag. And about that time, the other guy showed up, and Jim was able to stomp off and go back to work. Well, there are many stories like that. I don't want to get off on them.
Did the other side accuse you of bringing in a ringer there and a former college football player and a Marine named Jim Neal?
He was a Marine, that's right.
Yeah. You graduated from Vanderbilt Law School in
1957.
Mm-hmm. And what did you do then, Jim?
Well, I didn't have to apply for a job. They had one for me.
All right.
Well, actually, you had to apply for OCS. I went to Navy
OCS,
Officer Candidate School.
of the United States Navy.
U.S. Navy, that's right.
Yeah, okay, mm-hmm.
And that was a learning experience. You think that you have a pretty good sense of who you are until you enter OCS, when you are informed in very clear ways that you really aren't. You aren't who you think you are. You just start at the bottom. There's no pec order at which you're not on the bottom. But it was a good learning experience.
When did you decided that you were going to enlist in OCS in the Navy after your graduation from Vanderbilt? When did you make that decision?
Oh, sometime earlier, because see, these were the days of this was the aftermath of the Korean War. Everybody went to service.
There was a draft at that time?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
And I didn't want to go in the draft. You could apply for OCS, or you could wait for the draft, and that was not an option.
So you, where did you attend OCS?
Newport, Rhode Island.
Okay, and then you served in the Navy for how many years?
The stipulation was OCS plus 3 years. Turns out I was in Japan. Life was good, and I extended for another 6 or 8 months.
By the way,
4 years basically.
Oh, by the way, before we talk about your experience in Japan, why did you select the Navy as opposed to the United States Army or any other branch of the military?
It just attracted me. My brother had gone to the Naval Academy, so I was sort of oriented in that direction.
Yeah.
I like the Navy, but it was a good choice.
So after OCS in Newport, did you go immediately to Japan, or how did that work?
No, my first assignment was to Hawaii.
Okay.
And I was there on the staff of the Commander-in-Chief Pacific, which is the big boss, 4-star admiral in charge of all the Pacific theater, all military activities. So I was in that command for about a year.
And what did you do in the Navy in Hawaii?
Well, in addition to learning how to surfboard and drink Mai Tais and the like, it was the command activity were far above my experience scale, because I was a junior officer, again the most junior officer there, but we were involved in matters that some of which were highly classified. We were the level at which communication between the military and the non-military came across. So I had a bit of experience in Laos as in the intelligence world, but generally speaking, it was just a very interesting experience in paradise.
Now you were a lawyer.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So tell me when I assume Uncle Sam began to use your legal skills in the Navy.
I'd of course gone to justice school, as all of us did, right after OCS.
Tell us what justice school is.
Justice is in Newport Island. and is right down the street from OCS, as far as that's concerned. So I was schooled in naval justice, which is to say the court-martial system. But I did virtually none of that at SINCPAC.
SINCPAC was when you were in Hawaii.
That's right. That's right. But I mean, I learned a lot at SINCPAC. Make no doubt about that. I learned how big organizations work. But I was not involved in the naval justice system until my second tour of duty, which was in Japan.
Before we get to that, let me ask you: had you taken the bar exam before you went to the Navy?
Oh yes. Took
So
the
you
bar
were-
exam right out of law school, and passed the bar. So that was no issue.
So after a year in Hawaii, Uncle Sam sends you to Japan, and tell us what you did in the Navy in Japan.
I was assigned as deputy to the prosecutor for the Naval Marine Forces Far East, which was a pretty responsible job. It made sense from the standpoint of the Bureau of Naval Personnel to have a second assignment as a deputy to a prosecutor. I was comfortable because I assumed at that point that everything I didn't know, I would learn, because the guy who was handling it had been in the Navy for a long time. So under that supposition, I arrived in Japan, had hardly started before my boss ends up with some type of medical ailment, goes back to California, and I'm there stuck on an interim basis with the jurisdiction for continuing the prosecution out there, and he never comes back. So I had a real baptism of fire early on.
So you became, with his departure,
I became the acting prosecutor, and again, talking about Jim Neal, when he was trying Jimmy Hoffa, I talked with him and pointed out to him that, look, you're trying Jimmy Hoffa. Son, I've had a lot more days in court than you have.
what kind of cases were you prosecuting?
Everything. The General Court Martial is basically the federal criminal court, and we handle every type of jurisdiction except none of the small stuff. So I remember vividly the first significant case that I got. Hadn't been there very long, and I was still in the BOQ, Bachelor Officer Quarters, and about 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning, a rap came upon my door. It was a message from the Office of Naval Intelligence people to kindly come promptly to the coroner's office at the hospital to supervise the autopsy of a young man who had just been murdered about 5 hours before. So that's the way.
You'd been trained for this at Vanderbilt Law School.
Yeah, well, yeah, you don't never get trained for things like this. But in other words, it was a situation here where you did it on your own ingenuity because you had to do it. So I had that jurisdiction for a good many months, and we really got it down pretty well. And then I got assigned as the Chief Defense Counsel, and that was a hell of a lot more fun than being the prosecutor. But we kept that docket going, tried a lot of cases, learned a lot, and I came away a much better lawyer for it.
I assume the first case you ever tried as a lawyer was when you were in the Navy as a prosecutor.
That's right.
So as a prosecutor.
That's right.
About how many cases, how many courts-martials did you handle?
Oh, I couldn't imagine that. We a lot. We had pretty broad jurisdiction.
Where were these trials held, Jim?
Well, we had our territory was Japan, Korea, and Okinawa, and all three places.
On land, on sea, both?
None of them were at sea, but many of them involved the 7th Fleet, which had a lot of personnel out there, and they were always getting in trouble because they'd coop them up on board ship, and then they'd get out into the community and get in trouble. So we had a lot of problems out there.
I imagine that was incredible training for you as a lawyer. Well, you already were a lawyer, but
I was a lawyer, and that's why, as I observed a moment ago, Eddie Morgan, his evidence was so important. And one of the things I really learned there is that being a trial lawyer and practicing in a court-martial or in a trial situation, a little bit like catching a baseball off balance. You never know exactly how the ball is going to come to you, and you've got to develop the instinct to be able to respond, to be able to cast your question in the way that is admissible or best admissible, and it just takes time to develop that.
When did you complete your service in Japan?
61.
1961.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, where'd you go next, Jim?
Well, of course, the first thing I did was take a few weeks and months and travel. But having finally come back to the United States, I had picked up infectious hepatitis in Southeast Asia, which had continued to plague me. So when I finally got back, I had to recuperate for a good long time. Couldn't ever get back up to speed. And so I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't expect to practice in Memphis, but as it turned out, I was slowed down. Pace was slow, and I began to get drawn into what was going on. And then I went to the firm which I stayed with for 30 years, and had a good experience.
Before we get to that, I want to go back to an area you mentioned about your service in the Navy. You said Southeast Asia. You mentioned Laos earlier.
That's right.
Tell us about what you did in Laos.
Well, it was highly classified because everything we were doing out there was classified. We were at our command, we were the level at which the communication between the military and then the civilian agencies played out. And that's what I said, that I didn't do what most lawyers did. So we were then trying to maintain a presence in Laos. This is before the Vietnam War, in which the domino theory would not knock Laos off. It was, I think history has demonstrated that it was not a sound theory, but we thought it was. So we were out there involved in activities that were clandestine, frankly.
When you say classified, is it hard to remember what you had to keep secret?
Just really the activities out there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We had troops out there that were attempting to maintain pressure and to play dirty tricks on the path at Laos and whatnot. But that's all. It's all now in the books.
Yeah, yeah. You said that you developed some health issues in Laos, and so you had to have some recovery from that. How long did that take, Jim?
Actually, I picked it up in Indonesia, which was sort of the counterpart to Laos. It was Sukarno days back in those times.
Sukarno was?
Sukarno was the nationalist figure. He was a George Washington, or the Charles de Gaulle of Indonesia. But he was a middle-of-the-roader when it's almost like they say in Texas, the only thing in the middle of the road is a dead armadillo. Well, that was the way we felt about Sukarno. So we were dealing in his affairs as well, and so anyway, somewhere I picked up that disease, and it stays with you, and it was a difficult time.
Where did you have your recovery for this? Did you come back to Memphis for that? Or?
Yeah, I started out in a hospital in Colombo, Sri Lanka, and that's the end of the world.
You know, I asked you earlier when you were a young man whether you had any interest in, whether you foresaw your involvement in politics in life, and you said under Boss Crump there wasn't a lot of opportunities for that. When you're having this incredible experience in the Navy, in Japan, in Indonesia, in Laos, did that begin to whet your appetite for getting into public life and perhaps politics someday?
I think what did was the fact that this was the time of John F. Kennedy, and his eloquence really spoke to us. I don't mean just me, all of us. And that was his famous words, ask not what your country may do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Fellow Navy man.
That's right, I believed it. Still believe it, as a matter of fact.
You would have been in the Navy when he was elected president in 1960, correct?
That's right.
Yeah. Did you ever meet him?
No.
Because I know you've met some presidents. You met at least one president. We'll talk about that and work closely with him. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So you come back to Memphis, have your recovery, and you said you really, I believe you said a few moments ago, you really didn't expect you were going to come back to Memphis to practice law.
I expected probably to live in California.
I was going to ask
the friends you meet in the service that seem to be the most interesting people tended to go to New York, San Francisco, Chicago. So that's what I assumed I would gravitate there. I have a lot of friends there.
What part of California were you interested in?
Northern California. When I still love the place.
Yeah.
But anyway, I started out practicing law here, and it turned out to be a satisfying and gratifying type of experience.
Now, how did it come about? I know you said you came back to Memphis came back home for part of your recovery. How did you end up going into private practice here in Memphis?
Well, I had an uncle who was at what was then called Monadonico, and so he invited me to come on over and join the firm. And so I thought about it, decided to do that. Then I got married, and then we built a life here and a family.
You joined the Monadonico firm in 1961?
Well, I'm not quite sure. No, it wasn't 61. It was a little after that, a few months after that.
Okay.
So then I was there until I entered the public service again in 1993.
Now, let's talk about, you mentioned probably the most important topic you've mentioned, and that is your remarkable wife, Lucia. Tell us about Lucia, where y'all met, and where she was from.
She went to Vanderbilt. She was a young, impressionable co-ed. I was one of the more mature, older law students at the time. So I didn't really know her well, but she was in New York working when I came back from 4 years of overseas.
But y'all had met when
yeah, so I knew her. So anyway, I looked her up, and we both seemed to be going in the same direction, and next thing you know, I get married.
Where's Lucia from?
Jackson, Mississippi.
And you said y'all met at Vanderbilt. Were you was it just friends at that time?
Yeah, but you see, there's an age difference, right? 4-year age difference. And that's a big difference back in those days.
Yeah. But how did you stay in touch with her?
I didn't, but we had mutual friends, and the friends said, well, Lucia Flowers is in New York, so I came back.
Lucia, her maiden name?
Flowers, Flowers. And so then I looked her up right there, and then we hit it off, because both of us were at the time of our lives when change was going to happen, and so we got together and it worked, and we've had 50 years of wonderful, almost 50 years of wonderful marriage.
You were married when?
64.
1964, and you've had a family along the way?
3 children.
Tell me about your 3 children, Jim.
2 girls and a boy. They're all just doing fine. Each of them has a family. Each of them has children, so we now have blessed with 8 grandchildren. These days when people say, what are you doing? I say, well, it depends on which day you ask, but it's going to be, if I can make it happen, something to do with grandchildren.
You have how many grandchildren
8.
now? 8 grandchildren. Yeah. Tell me the names of tell us the names of your 3 children and where they are now.
Our daughter, Kate, is here. She actually kind of works. She kind of runs the family office. I don't practice law anymore, although I've been a consultant on a number of significant transactions. And then I have a second daughter, Liz, who's lived overseas most of her life. She went to Berkeley and almost, you might say, never quite came home, but she now is home in Memphis. And a son, Jim, who went to Carolina and then got his master's in business at Columbia, and he is here too.
Did any of your kids follow you to Vanderbilt?
No.
Did any kids go to Webb?
No.
All right. Okay. But they all went to great schools.
Well, they did.
Yeah.
They did.
Yeah. I want to talk a little more about Lucia, because it's an understatement to say that y'all are kindred spirits in terms of your community involvement over the years. Did you know that about her when you met her, that she was somebody who really wanted to be involved in public life?
Oh, I don't think she did. I think
Really?
she was interested in building a family, and these things simply came along. She had been president of her sorority at Vanderbilt.
Which sorority was that?
Kappa Alpha Theta.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
But her interest in the community sort of developed as she went. She started out, I guess the first significant thing was she was president of Junior League here. And from that effort, she moved on. She was then chairman of the Orpheum, which was then about to be torn down.
The Orpheum is the old theater.
The old theater,
Memphis.
the wonderful grand theater in Memphis, and so she and a small group of friends essentially saved it and managed to get the financing to make it happen.
This would have been about what year?
Well, I don't know,
Late
Bill,
70s,
about
early 80s? Uh-huh.
yeah, about then.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And she was chairman of the Center City Commission, which is you might say that pitted the downtown business community against the housing community for the underserved. It was a good job in terms of compromising on community needs and interests, and other things. And then and because she had got to be a friend of Ned McWhorter in connection with the financing for the Orpheum, that she got a call one day from Ned, who was then running for governor, and he said that he was going to be in town and wanted to visit with her. She says, "Ned, why do you want to visit with me?" And he said, basically, "I'll tell you when I'm here." So she ended up being chairing his campaign in Shelby County.
Had y'all been involved in politics before that time?
Well, I knew a lot of people who were. We were friends of the Sassers, friends of the Gores, and of course friends of Ned McWhorter. But that was all part of being a lawyer and having a lot of interesting friends from different walks of life.
And so she chaired the campaign, the McWhorter for Governor campaign in
That's
Shelby
right.
County. And what did that lead to in terms of Lucia's life?
Well, to start with, Ned asked her if she would be interested in doing something in government and possibly coming to Nashville and joining him. And she said, no, I've got a husband and our children then were grown up. So so then she became the governor's representative for Shelby County. And that was a lot of fun because the issues of the community, which involved the states, often went right through her. And so she was back and forth to Nashville and sort of being the coordinator and liaison, and had a good time, and I think did a lot of good.
Now we're going to talk some more about what you and Lucia did in Washington in the 1990s. But before we get to that,
Okay.
Let's get back to your law practice. So you went to the Montadonico firm.
That's right.
In the early 60s after your naval service, and tell us about what did you establish your practice in, Jim?
Well, I originally was hired over there because I had some substantial trial practice. Frank Glankler, who later became one of my closest friends and our leading law partner, had such a prodigious practice that it was killing him. So I came in for the purpose of being, in effect, successor to Frank with a lot of that business was coming in. After a while, it just occurred to me that this really wasn't much fun, that waiting around to go to court and trying fender bender cases was not what I was here for. So my practice gravitated over to much broader area. And then over time, I got into other activities that are more familiar to lawyers, business, real estate. Did a good bit of commodities work. One of my close friends was the guy who built Donovan Enterprises into the world's largest cotton merchant, which is a huge business. And so I was involved
Your friend was?
Billy Donovan.
And it is Billy Donovan.
Oh, yeah, sure,
uh-huh.
sure.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about Donovan Enterprises and what that was. what that still is, excuse me.
Well, America is a pretty major player in the cotton business, and Memphis was the headquarters of the industry for generations before us. So he had developed a small company and grew it, and at each level there were always additional issues. So it became a worldwide company with offices or agents in 35 foreign countries, and was, if it had given it any chance, I would have been full time because there was always so much going on. But we had a lot of other clients and did a lot of work for Cook, which was in the grain business.
This would be Ned Cook.
Ned Cook was a primary lawyer for Prudential, which was a wonderful, feeder of financial business, and NBC. I didn't want to be on the board of NBC, but we did.
NBC was National
Bank of Commerce. Yeah, and it was just a broad practice.
So you, when did you make this sort of shift from trial practice into commodity, representing various commodities groups and businesses?
Well, we all know that in the law practice, you never know what's going to happen next. It gravitates. You do something, you do it well, you end up being sort of expert in that particular area, and next thing you know, you got another client involving an issue that's similar.
You mentioned Mr. Donovan, so Billy Donovan. How did y'all's friendship develop?
I knew him for years, and then in the process of living in the community and engaging in activities, we just kept doing things together. One of the activities that I really was kind of referring to, it's fun, it's pro bono, but it was the Liberty Bowl.
The Liberty Bowl is the annual football bowl game here.
That's right, but it didn't start here. It started up in Philadelphia, and it was kind of cold up there. So the guy who started was Bud Dudley, and he wanted to come to a place where he could have more dependable weather for his New Year's Day bowl. So he headed down here, and then we decided I got sort of leaned on by a couple of friends to going up to New York for the college football dinner at the Waldorf. So we went up there, and that process then we negotiated with Bud to make the Liberty Bowl's permanent home here in Memphis and create a nonprofit organization with all the rights to it right there, and therefore we anchored it to Memphis. Trouble is that then we had to finance it. And so a group of us, 20, 25 of us, really were the people who had to finance the darn thing. And Billy was one of those, as
Billy
were
Donovan was
all
one.
the leaders in our community in my time that we had to make this thing go.
Mr. Donovan ended up all sorts of sports activities. The Racket Club here in Memphis.
That's
Tell
right.
us about the Racket Club.
It didn't exist till he started. And that was world-class tennis with all the best that came here over years. And he also wanted to get an NFL team. And we worked hard to get an NFL team, and darn near got one, which was one of an awful close thing. And then he owned the Memphis football team, in the USFL.
The old USFL.
And he, we have a few leaders in the community, and I'd certainly commend him because he put about $12 million of his own money into that. He wasn't trying to be a football guy to be a football guy. He was trying to do it to have something here for this community. So these were all interesting, fun times in our community.
You mentioned the cotton industry.
Yep.
Memphis has always been the center of the world for the cotton industry, is it not?
That's right.
And that continues to this day?
To a much lesser extent. It's merely gone worldwide now. So we sold Donovan about 5 years ago to a big French conglomerate, so that it was Cargill, which of course is a mega big company, was one of the players, and then Donovan, and then the other company was Louis Dreyfus Corp. So now Donovan is sold to Dreyfus, and the business, basically China's in the business, and Cargill's in the business, and Dreyfus is in the business, and it's a different business.
Jim, I want to talk about how your work in commodities in this area segued eventually into your service in Washington with the Department of Agriculture, but let's do that after a break.
Okay,
Good time
sounds
to take
good.
a break. Thank you, Jim. I want to go back to a story you were sharing with us earlier. Your experience as editor of the literary humor magazine at Vanderbilt, the Vanderbilt Chase. Was it the Vandy Chase or the Vanderbilt Chase?
Well, it's Vanderbilt.
There you go. Okay. And I understand that you had an experience with the Vanderbilt Chase that probably was your first legal experience before you became a lawyer. Tell us about that.
Yes, it was a legal experience, and I was not a lawyer. As a matter of fact, that totally predated my law career in any other respect. Coming out of the Mother's Day edition, I'd gone home, and I got a call from the Dean of Men, Dean Carmichael, saying that an unhappy minister from East Nashville had just left his office, and said that his problem was that his daughter's picture had appeared in our magazine. And what did I know about it? And I said, well, I'm afraid I don't know much about it at all. It resulted in a great deal of indignation because this particular picture had been in the print shop. We had picked it up coming in the middle of the year, having no idea that it was not something we had the authority to run. We ran it in the Mother's Day edition, whereupon we managed to become defendants in a lawsuit that attracted a lot of interest by the student body, as you can imagine. So as a consequence of that, then of course we said, wait a minute, there was no malice, we had no knowledge, there's no scienter of any ill activity that we're involved in, so the case ultimately went to the Supreme Court, where you'll find it as Langford versus Vanderbilt. I'm in it as a defendant, and all this happened before I was a lawyer. So you might say I had a legal career, yes, but also I had a pre-legal experience that was a formative experience itself.
What was the cause of action against you in the case?
The cause of action essentially was invasion of the right of privacy, and the Tennessee Supreme Court decision was the first one in Tennessee attempting to articulate what the right of privacy is in Tennessee. So that's why occasionally over the years, young associates have come in and said, Mr. Gilliland, was that Gilliland and Langford you? So, yep, that was me.
Who represented you?
Cecil Sims.
Cecil Sims.
He was a university lawyer and was a great guy, and that part of it was nice. But even until recent years, my class at Vanderbilt has talked about our lawsuit. You know, to come back and recall wonderful memories of your Vanderbilt education. Well, it wasn't our lawsuit, their lawsuit, it was my lawsuit.
What was the ultimate outcome of that case?
Ultimately, it was dismissed. Okay. There was no way you could establish a justiciable cause of action on what we did.
So,
but it's quite an experience to be sued for more than your inheritance, and you're not even 21 years old, or only 21 years old at the time.
That did not discourage you from starting Vanderbilt Law School the next year?
I'd already started law school. Oh. It was the fall of my first year, and the process server met me after class.
Well, that's an interesting experience.
Well, but that was an experience in law that you won't find in other records, Bill.
Let's go back to your years of practice in Memphis.
Right.
And you've told us about how your practice evolved from trial practice, litigation to more business work and commodities work and transactional work. I want to ask you about some of your community involvement over the years. We've mentioned the Liberty Bowl. What's the Memphis, for those who are watching this who are not Memphians, what was or is, I think, the Memphis Cotton Carnival?
It's very different now from what it used to be. It was the community's festival, and it started off back in the Depression when things were very bad, and it continued on to have many events, like, for example, over here, the concert on the river was a Cotton Carnival event. It had a lot of community activities, and it was a nice honor to be named the president of it, but there was an awful lot of work involved in trying to coordinate everything that you needed to put together something that big.
You were president of the Cotton Carnival?
Right.
And what year were you president of Cotton Carnival?
Early 70s. I don't remember what year.
Yeah, we have a technical issue. Let's take a short break.
Okay.
The problem is there are people. So, Jim, how did you get involved in Cotton Carnival?
Well, Bill, practically everybody was involved in Carnival in one way or the other because it was Memphis's event. It was a river carnival here where we came together to celebrate the city, and so I guess all of us were involved in some way or another.
Were you involved in this as a boy? Were you involved in your whole life?
The carnival had been here. I wasn't really involved in it, but I was, very engaged in activity. They had parades and they had public events of all types.
I remember as a boy we would watch the barge come in.
Oh, sure.
With the royalty on the barge.
Yeah.
Tell us about
the fireworks.
Fireworks.
That was all part of making Memphis, Memphis.
Yeah. Another thing you've been involved in, you were chairman of the Memphis Arts Council.
Sure.
Tell us about that and how you got involved in that.
Well, the way you get involved in a lot of these things is that you're there, that people are looking for others who are willing and able to do these pro bono community jobs. So, yeah, I'm involved in that type of thing. That's just all part of life.
Were you involved in that as a lawyer? Were you called upon that as part of your pro bono work as a lawyer?
No, community entirely. No, what he does, it simply attempts to raise funds on a community basis, which then are allocated to the arts organizations in relationship to their priority to the community.
Now, another area where you've provided leadership over the years in Memphis was with reference to Lemoyne-Owen College.
Yes.
Tell us what Lemoyne-Owen College is.
Lemoyne-Owen College is the United Negro College Fund college here in this area. It's an old school. Actually, it's probably older. In 1870, that makes it as old, if not older, than any other school in town. And it educated African Americans from those early times, and it was, again, that's community service. It has a board that is partly white, partly black, and is deemed to be a highly respected institution with a respected board. I was on the board for, gosh, about a dozen years. I chaired the board for a couple of years. And believe me, that was one of the hardest jobs I ever had, because you've got to navigate between groups with different interests, go around obstacles that can be political in nature but peculiar to the institution, and raise money, keep it solvent, keep it going, keep producing capable young men and women in our community.
Memphis, of course, people know our history in terms of civil rights issues. Were you involved in your in your career in any of these issues through your community leadership, such as Lemoyne-Owen, or any other way?
Well, I'm pleased to say I was, because it was the right thing to do. When I came out of the Navy, having lived 2.5 years in Japan, in a very egalitarian society, the Navy was really a meritocracy. Didn't care who you were or how important you were. It's everybody is entitled to the same chance. I sort of came back to Memphis and saw the community with different eyes, and I was involved very early on in respect to the civil rights activities. I was the president of a small organization called the Tennessee Council on Human Relations back about the time I got married, which is about 1964, well before Martin Luther King. I mean, civil rights didn't begin in Memphis with Martin Luther King. It was very active and very engaged well before then. But that's another story.
This is more recent, but I know that you have been a leader in the Gandhi Institute.
That's right.
Tell us what the Gandhi Institute is.
The grandson of the great Gandhi is Arun Gandhi. He's roughly contemporary of mine. And he had been doing peace things around the world and was brought into the University of Mississippi a good many years ago to do a program for them sometime after the James Meredith matter. He was down there and was doing a good job. He's a very articulate, peaceable, gracious man. And I heard him speak, and a group of us decided that he was a guy that really ought to get associated up here. So a group of us then went and talked to the head of Christian Brothers University here, who then offered him the opportunity for housing and to be on campus, to read, write, and to be to locate here. And he did that for a good number of years, and so that was in association with that. It had nothing really to do with Memphis, but having a guy as interesting as Arun Gandhi adds value to your life, and Memphis was glad to have him here for a while. Good many years.
Back to Lemoyne-Owen, another question about your leadership for Lemoyne-Owen College. It was created during a time when African Americans could not go to University of Memphis, the University of Tennessee, et cetera. And fortunately, that has changed. But do you believe there is still a future for single-race colleges such as Lemoyne-Owen?
I do, yes. Basically, the reason, a good statistic is this: you take the demographically similar or virtually identical student, introduce the student to college in a majority white institution versus the same student entering a UNCF college, and the likelihood of the student graduating, remaining with it, sticking on to get his degree is significantly higher in the African American community, the African American schools, the UNCF colleges, than it is in the majority white institutions. So if you measure success as getting through your years to maturity with a college degree, then yes, there's a strong case for African American education for UNCF college. When I was in the administration, somebody noticed on my background that I'd shared a UNCF college, so consequently I talked any number of times to people coming to Washington in the land grant institution world or in the UNCF world, and was involved in the efforts in the administration to level the playing field better in the federal sector. All that based upon my experiences and many relationships and friendships I made through Lemoyne-Owen experience.
You mentioned the administration. You're referring to?
The third chapter in my legal career, leaving aside the first experience is not, my lawsuit is not being one of the three chapters. Yes, I was in the Clinton administration.
Let's talk about that and what led to that. And you said this was the third chapter, the first chapter being your Navy service, the second chapter being your private practice in Memphis and your community involvement. And tell us about how you ended up, how Mr. Gilliland went to Washington. How did you end up going to Washington, D.C.?
All stories have lengthy roots, and this one does. We had, my wife and I had been good friends of people who were successful in public life, largely through Vanderbilt. My wife's shared a freshman house with Mary Gorman, who married Jim Sasser, and with Nancy Gore, who married Frank Hunger and was Al Gore's big sister. So consequently, we all knew all these people. We were just friends of theirs, and being of a fairly liberal persuasion, that I had been involved in trying to help with their political efforts in the past. So we got to be particularly good friends with the Gores. Al had been in the Congress in his district in Middle Tennessee. But he decided to run for the Senate, and so then one day Nancy called us and said,
Nancy Hunger.
Nancy Gore Hunger,
Nancy
that's
Gore
right.
Hunger.
Said, my little brother's going to run for the Senate. We want you guys to get well acquainted, because I knew him, but like, go away, kid. He's just a young kid back in those days. So then we had a party for him, and then chemistry worked well, and he stayed with us time and again. I seriously, probably maybe 50 times, because he would just come in. We had a pool house that had quarters in there, and he kept some clothes there. And since Memphis was the largest repository of the Democratic votes in the state, he was here often. So we were just good friends, and we talked and drank good wine and ran together, and so that's how the relationship really had its genesis.
Had you known his parents? Did you know Senator Gore and Pauline Gore?
Oh, yeah.
Tell me about, when did you first meet the Gore family?
Oh, gosh, I knew them back from the time I knew Nancy. So that would be years ago. That was long before Al Gore had anything to do with politics.
Were you involved in any of Albert Gore's campaigns?
No, not really. Not really. I was trying to practice law too hard at that point.
So was the first political campaign you were involved in young Al Gore's Senate campaign?
No, I tried to be involved with George Grider.
George Grider was?
He was a congressman here, but it was, it's community and politics really are part of the same cloth anyhow. It's all about priorities and making good things happen.
So in 1984, you're asked to help young Congressman Gore's campaign, and he sort of moves into your guest house. Tell us about how that friendship continued to evolve.
Well, it just did. We spent a lot of time together. Tipper and Lucia became very good friends, and then Al ran for president in '88. Did a very credible job of it, but nobody really expected him to get the nomination, and he didn't. But nobody expected him to go nearly as far as he did either. So he then acquitted himself very well. But that was an experience in which we were involved.
What did you and Lucia do in the '88 presidential campaign of then Senator Gore?
Well, had helped raise money, did things. I went to Hawaii, as a matter of fact. Senator Gore Sr. and I went out there since I had some friends in Hawaii back in the olden days. Then we went out and had one of my friends had been lieutenant governor and Supreme Court justice and had been involved in that world. So they got a group together for us, and we went out to sort of show the flag and talk about Al Gore in that year, which was '88, and future years. So you might say I went to Hawaii when Lucia went to New Hampshire at more or less the same time.
And then Senator Gore, of course, did not prevail in '88. But what happened after that?
Well, I thought his aspirations would not involve vice presidency. None of us did. His son had been injured in an automobile accident when he was a little kid, run over by a guy after a baseball game in Baltimore. So then when Bill Clinton becomes the presidential nominee, the question was who was going to be the vice president. And so I didn't think it would be Al Gore. It just wasn't on my radar. And we were in the Smokies, and we had a place in Elkmont. You Knoxvillian friends will know that area well. And so we got a call there, a note on the mantelpiece from the caretaker to call Senator Gore, and left a number. So I called over there, about dark, must have been 7:30 at night, and it reached his office, and I said, just calling back. He had called, and so his assistant said, well, yeah, I think he wants to visit. Let me see if I can run him down. He was over in the cloakroom of the Senate at that hour, and he said, Bill Clinton came to see me yesterday, and I think I'm on his short list for vice president. And he said, I think it's a short list. And he said, what do you think? Any thoughts or your comments on it? And I basically said, well, I'm so surprised, but one way I'm not surprised. And if the chemistry works, I think it'll do fine. But
why did you express surprise?
Because the two guys are essentially the same people. They were both Southerners. They're both moderates. They're both the same age. They had the same voter constituency. That's why.
It defied conventional political wisdom.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, what happened?
So next thing you know, then he's in the race, and Lucia was then. My wife, Lucia, went to Washington at their invitation as the Gore chair of the Presidential Inaugural Committee, which is the big party in Washington. I mean, it's a big event. And so she's there working and having fun. And I'm back in Memphis practicing law, and I'm not having fun. So then some talk, would you be interested in doing anything in Washington? Oh, no, I'm way too busy. Too important to the community to go to Washington.
Who initiated that talk? Where did you first hear about it?
I don't know. I mean, just the idea that all that excitement was going on in Washington, that it wasn't spreading down here to Memphis was sort of gets to you for a while. So anyway, then I got a call. I was back in East Tennessee with Jim Raines, my law partner. We were trying to work something out, and we're in Kingsport coming back. And he said, I'm going to call the office. You want to talk to your secretary? I said, no, it's a bad day. Let's start another one tomorrow. And so he came back and he said, your secretary really wants to talk to you. The vice president-elect is calling you. So the next morning, I called him at home and said, hi, Al, this is Jim. He said, oh, hi, Jim. So pause. And he said, you know, Jim, the girls have been talking about you. And I said, yeah, well, I know. And he said, I just want you to know that it would be our great pleasure if you would be interested in joining my administration. So I said, that's awfully nice, but let me think about it. So I did, and it seemed like it was still a lot more fun in Washington than it was here.
Did the vice president-elect mention a particular position at that time?
No.
Just something in the administration?
He just said talk to Peter Knight and see if there's anything they think it might be of interest to you, and when we could talk about it.
Peter Knight is?
Peter Knight was the head of transition. He was the head of putting people in and selecting the right people for the right jobs. So I didn't know what to do. Jim Sasser rang me, and he said he knew what was going on, and he said, you know, I want you to consider Assistant Secretary of Defense, because there's a job over there that he works with a good bit in connection with military capital appropriations. And he said, I think we would get along well. Well, I didn't know anything about that job. And so I was really back and forth. I didn't want to make an utter fool out of myself going into something I didn't understand. So finally, largely by reason of the fact that I had had an unusual amount of activity and involvement and understanding of the international commodities world, then Peter Knight suggested a good place might be for you to go as the General Counsel for the Department of Agriculture. That's where the idea really came from. I had a plum book, as they call it, which lists all of the important appointed jobs in Washington. And so I couldn't find anything in there that I really knew how to do, but at least I knew what a lawyer did. I knew generally what a general counsel did. And so I said, well, let's take a look at it. And that started the ball rolling, and I ended up going to Washington and in that capacity.
And Lucia also went to Washington at that time?
Oh, yeah.
And what did she do?
She might be defined. She was the adult, the resident adult in the White House, the West Wing, and for the Vice President's people. And that's a pretty apt description because she was there. She took a non-paying job, so then she could deal with people on political issues that the paid staffers could not deal with. And this had to be a very great need because you deal with so many people who are important to the administration who get their feelings hurt about something. And you need to have someone that can deal with them sort of on a peer-to-peer basis and then serve in many other different ways. So she had a pretty broad and very interesting life. It was really, she knew more about what was going on than I did because, believe me, the Department of Agriculture, the news rarely gets that far. So I had to come home at night and find out what was going on in Washington from her.
Now, as exciting as I'm sure this was, did you have any reticence about leaving home in Memphis and your?
Oh, sure. Just scared to death. Say, what on earth have I gotten myself into? But it worked out. But it was a real tense experience going into a new job that had such a vast scope of it and having so much responsibility. But I'd never had anything like the level of responsibility that I got in Washington.
Your firm at the time, it started off as the Monadonico firm, and then you said that what was your firm when you left it?
It was then Glankler, Brown, Gilliland, and then a couple others. But of course, when you enter senior government service, then you got to take your name out, so there's no evidence of conflict. So now it's just Glankler, Brown, PLLC.
What was the reaction of your Frank Glankler and the other and Jim Raines and your other partners?
Oh, I think everybody was happy. It was exciting. I didn't expect to stay more than a couple, 3 years. I really sort of signed up, mentally speaking, for the first term, and that would be essentially almost 4 years. And that was what my intention was. But then once I got there, then I stayed on further. We had an independent counsel that was investigating the department, and we had then a new Secretary of Agriculture, Dan Glickman, and he said, Jim, you're the only guy with the continuity on this thing that you just can't leave me for a while. So I then stayed an extra about 9 months to a year to sort of work through all that, which ends up being a lot to do about nothing. But it sure was painful to have to go through.
You and Lucia moved to Washington in January?
Well, we bought a house in Washington. We did not leave our house in Memphis. So if that had been part of the deal, I don't think I'd have gone because, your home is really very important. I sleep better at home.
Where in Washington did you live?
Very nice area, Calorama up above DuPont Circle.
Tell us about, I want to hear some more about your new job in 1993 as General Counsel for the Department of Agriculture.
Well, as a lawyer by that time with over 30 years experience, I knew what general counsels did, but I didn't know what I would do as a general counsel of the Department of Agriculture. And that still is pretty hard to define, because I had a staff of about 300 lawyers who were all over the world doing all kinds of different things that I knew nothing about. We had a couple of guys that didn't do anything except travel east and west with trade matters. We had one guy that spoke Spanish and Portuguese and essentially traveled north and south. So that you had so many diverse skills in the department that it was pretty hard to know quite what everybody did. We also had lawyers active reporting to me in 27 different offices, and with a shrinking budget and greater technology, I managed to cut them to 17 offices, which of course gives you the same experience as trying to close a military base. You try to close an agricultural service office in Lincoln, Nebraska, and it's not easy because congressmen defend these things. So that was part of it. But part of the job was classic get out the work lawyer stuff. I knew how to do that, and we had a lot of that. We had in terms of the loan activity, our loan portfolio was second only to Citicorp in those days. Now think about how big that was. We had about 750,000 single-family dwellings that we financed, and that was only the beginning. Then we had the rural development function, which for USDA was equivalent to what HUD had for the urban areas, we had for the smaller rural side of it. And then we had the National Forests of America, which were the most litigious parts of the system, because that was where the controversies were. I inherited the Spot Owl case, which people may remember, which had effectively closed down the Pacific Northwest because it enjoined the taking of further timber off of federal lands in the Pacific Northwest until they could get the system right to protecting the viability of the species. So it was a broad jurisdiction from the standpoint of the lawyer side of it. And then there was also the fact that I came in as a policy officer, which is almost a term of art, which is kind of like meaning that I also had the capacity to deal at the senior level, sort of like the board of directors of General Motors. We met and we discussed these policy issues. So that was a different experience from serving the legal needs of the department.
Did you have much interaction with the president?
No. Saw him a lot, but actually there was one time when I was the ranking guy on board to go to a cabinet meeting over there, but I just showed up and didn't say anything.
But you sat in the cabinet room with
Well,
them?
I mean, these are, there wasn't much to it.
What did you find most interesting about this job, Jim?
Most interesting thing I ever did. I think it was the opportunity at my time in life. I'd made my grub stake. You know, the money didn't make any difference at that point. I had done everything in the practice of law that I had hoped to do. I felt good about that. But there was a challenge that affected a broader scope of activity, and that was just really what I felt was on my agenda, what I wanted to do. And it did every bit of that.
Did you ever feel overwhelmed by the job at any
Oh,
point?
sure. Lots of times.
How'd you deal with that?
When I first came in, I tried to lay out what my goals and objectives were going to be, and the very first thing I said to myself, and really tried to carry on this, the first thing, the message I want to get through to everybody in the building is that I'm first and foremost a lawyer, and a good lawyer, and a listening lawyer, and that's what counts, not politics or opinions. And that was, I tried to do it all the way through. I was complimented at the very end that one of my senior people at the Bethosian say that he wanted to say I'd never ever expressed any political, favored any legal judgment that came before the department on the basis of politics. Now look, I care about politics. I care about, where the world and the community is going. But when you're hired on as a lawyer, you got to be a lawyer.
Did you have any responsibilities as a spokesperson for the Department of Agriculture?
Oh, sure.
And tell us
From time
about
to
that.
time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I always thought I would, I deserved someday to make the front page of the New York Times. Well, I did. I got bashed on a policy issue where I had to meet the press, but that's just part of life.
What was the issue?
It had to do with international trade. It's a fairly complicated issue of how we handle foreign agricultural trade. These were things the typical person wouldn't know much about, but we had a lot of foreign activities. I also found out after I got there that I was in the decision tree, as they called it, to wind up the Uruguay round of negotiations, out of which the WTO arose.
The WTO being
the World Trade Organization is the trade rules that govern how countries deal with trade matters. And so that too was an experience which was out of my knowledge, but I had to deal with these issues as well, as best I could.
Did you make many speeches during that part of your life?
Yeah, as you come in and you expect to do that. And after a while, you really get down to stump speeches, and you get to where that's sort of expected.
When you gave speeches, did you have a transcript, or did you use a teleprompter? What did you use for that?
Depends on what I was doing. Sometimes it was a matter of coming in and just expressing a welcome to be there. Other times there would be policy issues that we decided we wanted to press, and then you prepare your speech. Now I had a speechwriter that worked for the small group of us who were the assistant secretaries, and that was helpful because you always had a script, and you wanted to make sure what was on the script, and you'd typically give the script to the press and let them quote that rather than some damn fool situation where you put your foot in your mouth. So yeah, that was very helpful.
I've never had any experience in using a teleprompter. Prior to this, had you used a teleprompter before?
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, it's not a natural experience. You're trying to read the teleprompter and talk at the same time. So I don't know how the presidents can stand up before Congress and make a speech from a teleprompter, but it takes some experience, yeah.
Do you remember I'm just curious, the famous story about President Clinton giving the State of the Union address and the wrong speech was on the teleprompter?
Oh, I remember that, yeah.
Share that story.
Well, it's a short story that other people know certainly as well as I, but he stands up to give his State of the Union speech, and the teleprompter, these things to your right and your left, so you look this way and you look that way, like you're looking, including all the crowd. And he looks on his teleprompter and he realizes that it's the wrong speech. It's the previous year's speech. So then he is trying to make his speech with all the American public listening, and the teleprompter was giving him the wrong speech. So that went on for at least a few seconds, maybe half a minute or a minute before they got the right one up there. And that would have been a terrifying experience, wouldn't it?
But the amazing thing is the way he handled it.
That's right.
No one knew, except I guess. Well, were you, when there was a State of the Union message? Were you in the?
Oh no. They only had the secretary. That was a coveted seat.
Yeah.
Well, one of the policy officers always had to stay back at home with security, because the security reached down that far. So we sort of swapped in among the assistant secretaries to see who was going to be there at any given time, because we also had certain responsibilities and security concerns.
What was I'm just curious about what was life like? You were there for how many years? I'm sorry.
4 years.
4 years.
Well, 4.5 years.
4.5 years.
Ended up, yeah.
What was life like for the Gillilands living in Washington, D.C. During that time?
Well, because Al Gore was then seen as the heir apparent to the Democratic nomination, we were blessed in terms of social invitations, because to be a member of the administration, and particularly to be someone who was seen as being close to the next president of the United States, let's say it did wonders for for your invitation list. So yeah, we did a lot of that, but it was just all, it was all so fast, and that it got to be tiring. It was kind of like, as they say, getting a drink out of a fire hose. There was so much going on all the time. But we made some wonderful friends there, and it was fun to read the papers. I had people at our house for dinner who had done a lot of interesting things.
Did you attend any state dinners during that time?
Oh yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, tell us what that was like.
Well, it's just very, very nice events in every respect. They have the state dinners, depending on the weather, but a state dinner out on the lawn outside of the White House, looking toward the Lincoln Memorial, and they're just really elegant parties. Now, we've been to any number of events at the White House, which always a thrill to do that.
Did you get to spend a lot of time? I know you said you didn't have a lot of interaction with the president, but did you get spend a lot of time with your friends, the Gores, during those years?
Well, Lucia did, because she was there for them. For example, when we came in, they were trying to renovate the vice president's residence at the observatory. So Al and Tipper were far too consumed in their lives to be able to spend the time and effort to make all of the dozens of decisions that had to be made about what they were going to do, fixing this, you don't fix that. And so they asked Lucia to basically be their person to deal with with all the little matters and moving them into the house at the Naval Observatory. So, yeah, we talk with them from time to time. Lucia much more so than I did, because she saw Al most days, and was she also considered herself to be sort of the keeper of the faith insofar as involving women in government and administration. And so she and a couple other gals started the Women's Leadership Forum for the Democratic Party in both the 96 and the 2000 election. A lot of fun, Bill.
I can imagine, or I can't imagine. You stayed through the first Clinton administration, and then you said sometime in the second administration, you and Lucia decided to leave D.C. at that time. Is that right?
Right.
What was the basis for the decision to move on?
Oh, just tired. It just wears you out. I had all of it, all I could take, and it was a good thing, because I had other things in my life I wanted to do that kind of superseded going to the office again. You see, part of the problem is that when you enter a job like that, the secretary or another assistant secretary never wants to make any decision without being absolutely certain that he checks in with his counsel first, right? I wouldn't either, because I want to make sure I've got my lawyer behind me on the matter. So that meant that there's a constant flow of issues coming in. So I was my job was sort of controversy central. If it wasn't a controversy, I might not be involved in it. If there was a controversy, I was involved in it. And that tires you out after a while. The job would be, as it turned out, the job was less general counsel in the sense that you advise the secretary, and like in a corporate sense, than it was that I was the Attorney General for the state of agriculture, in that the opinion was not a personal one so much as it was that I was discharging my statutory responsibility to be in charge of law and legal policy for the department.
You said that at that time in your life there were, quote, some other things I wanted to do. What did you want to do
That's
at
right.
that point?
Well, everything else in life. I had what I consider to be a full run of the law from my first exposure at Vanderbilt, you might say, through these other experiences, and I just simply wanted to spend some time hiking in Wyoming, and reading books, and going fishing in Arkansas in May, and that's sort of what I wanted to do. Spend time with the children and grandchildren.
How old were you when you left Washington?
Let's see, I was 63, I guess.
Still a young man.
That's right, still a young man.
Of
You got a
course.
lot of life when you get 63, that's right.
Yeah. So did you, you and Lucia came back to Memphis at that time?
Yes.
And did you return to law practice, or
No.
did you?
No. I didn't do it, and I think there was, I intended to do it, and I think that my colleagues, they really encouraged me to do it, but at that point, I had other things I wanted to do. I wanted to be involved in the 2000 election, although believe me, when people said, what office do you want? If Al's elected president, I said, none. Been there and done that. But I wanted to help in the campaign, and by that time I was sort of worn out. I was bitterly disillusioned with the Bush versus Gore decision, which put politics right back into the Supreme Court where it didn't belong. And so other life intervened, and I'm glad it did.
Let's talk about, before we talk about that, though, let's talk about that 2000 campaign. You said when you and Lucia were in Washington that everyone regarded the vice president as the heir apparent.
Correct.
After follow President Clinton. Were you and Lucia involved in the 2000 campaign?
I was the chairman of the Rural and Small Town America Initiative. And now we knew perfectly well that the overwhelming majority of that constituency was going to vote Republican. They always have for the last 100 years. But what we wanted to do was to neutralize it, to be there, to be able to present with that constituency with the proposition that there are other alternatives, and particularly in the swing states. So in that process, then I worked a good bit. I did 3 of the 4 regional debates on behalf of the Democratic Party in the presidential campaign, which were kind of fun, kind of interesting. We talked about teleprompters and things like that. So I was briefly in that world, and I'm glad I'm not. Glad I was, but then glad I'm not now.
Where were you on election night 2000?
Nashville.
In Nashville.
Right, with Ned McWhirter.
A memorable night.
That's right.
Tell us some of your memories.
When they announced Florida for Al, there was a wonderful joy in the air, and then they pulled it back. But I didn't really quite understand how that it really was in doubt until later. And so then we waited outside. Ned and Roy Neal, who had been his chief of staff, and I waited outside. And after a while, Frank Hunger came out because he had been inside with the family and said, "Not going to be a decision tonight. You guys better go back and go to bed." That was bad. That was an awful night.
Were you involved in all the efforts in Florida over the next several weeks?
No,
in the
wasn't
recount
anything I
efforts?
could do down there.
You said, and this is understandable, that you were very disillusioned with the ultimate Supreme Court decision on that. Tell us about your feelings about that.
I felt that when you were on the bench, politics stopped. Stopped at when you raise your hand, take that oath, politics is all over. It can't be a consideration in anything that you do. And I felt that the way this came out, that it is very much involved in politics, including that the court expressly stated this was not to be authority for any other subsequent decisions. So I guess I was disappointed in my Supreme Court.
Were you surprised by the decision?
Yes.
You were not anticipating
Oh no.
the decision.
No. And David Boyce had become to be a friend.
David Boyce
Yes.
is the attorney.
Yes.
His involvement in the Bush v. Gore decision was?
Pardon?
He was the attorney in the Bush
Yes,
v. Gore case.
he was, yeah. But he had just come up because there had been another Court of Appeals case in Atlanta. He had just blew up there in time to get there and argue before the Supreme Court, basically. It was a hectic time.
After that disappointing election, tell me what the next year of your life was, Jim, or has been.
The last years since then have been the sort of years that you hope to have when you practice law to the point where you say, I've been there, done that, I'm ready to do something different. And that's what my life has consisted of. I had a lot of good friends. So you see them pass, and you kind of hate, because I imagine nearly half my class seems to no longer be around. But I think we did the best we could when we could.
Mm-hmm. So tell us about some of your activities that you and Lucia enjoy now in life.
My life is involved with with children, with things I like to do. We travel a good bit. I mentioned going fishing. I'm doing that tomorrow.
Where are you going fishing tomorrow?
I'll go to Arkansas to Memphis. It's an old hunting and fishing place. Been there for 100 years with big virgin cypress and birds and fish and turtles and such as that.
Who's joining you?
A couple of friends from Kentucky.
Are you traveling much these days?
A fair amount, yeah.
And where have you and Lucia traveled over the years?
Gosh, nearly everywhere. Traveled a lot during the administration, but these travels are entirely different. Go to California, go to the Smokies. I would go to Europe this summer.
Have you been back to Japan?
Yes.
And
yes.
when were you most recently back in Japan?
About 5 years ago.
I know you're a man of letters. What are you reading these days?
Mostly history.
Mm-hmm. And particularly, tell us some of the history books you've read over the last recently.
I have read. I think most recently I've been reading a good bit more about the Revolutionary War, what was going on, why the Revolutionary War developed as it did, and I probably and you probably as well had ancestors who were at the Battle of Kings Mountain in North Carolina that had a lot of impact on the Revolution. I didn't know much about it until later. So these are fun things I'm doing.
Yeah. I think you have said that you're proud to be of a liberal persuasion and a Democrat. What are you hopeful about the future?
I am very concerned that the future, what we're doing to our planet, has got some terrible consequences to it. It's not just because that I believe everything Al Gore does, it's because he's right. I also read a good bit of science, and this is what concerns me most about our grandchildren's futures.
You stay in touch with the Vice President?
Haven't talked to him for a good long time. He's leading a different world now, a different life now. Had lunch with Tipper last winter in Nashville. We were over there.
Yeah. How's she doing?
She's doing pretty good.
Good.
They aren't divorced. They just live different lives. They're separated. And last year, about a year before last, they all came together, went to, had Christmas together. So it's not a life that I would feel comfortable in, but it works for them.
Yeah. Any young people ever come to you and say, Mr. Gilliland, I'm thinking about being a lawyer? And if so, what do you tell them?
A lot of people have said that. The first thing I try to do when I talk to the young people is to ask this question and say, why do you want to be a lawyer? What drives you to want to even raise the question? And I think that's really a good way to get them to look at it, because if you don't know why you want to be a lawyer, you shouldn't be a lawyer. It's hard work, it's thankless, and sure, you may make some money, but you pour your life into something. If you don't really believe in it, you should be doing something different.
But if a young man or woman says to you, Mr. Gilliland, I really want to be a lawyer, do you encourage
that's
them?
fine, do it. Yeah. Sure.
Is there anything else that you would like to share with us today about your remarkable life, Jim?
Well, thanks for the nice compliments, and appreciate being here. I have nothing else to share except that I appreciate the Tennessee Bar Foundation collecting memoirs from all of us old-timers.
We appreciate you, Jim. Thank you.